I think the bottom line is this is going to help European manufacturers, it's going to help us build more in Europe to export more there. India will increase it in terms of its partnership potential for our industry over the years, but nothing will replace China in the short to medium term future, that's for sure. We hope for a quick ratification of the Indian deal, but that remains to be seen.
Europe has pushed for new trade deals amid challenges in larger markets like China and the U.S. Now the EU and India have wrapped their negotiations for a free trade agreement. We're interested in what that means for one of Europe's largest industries. Jonathan O'Riordan is Director of International Trade at the European Automobile Manufacturers Association. He joins me now from Brussels. Jonathan, thanks for joining me. Just a few days ago, you wrote that you were actually afraid that some of the important details would be left out of this deal in the rush to conclude negotiations. Now that the negotiations are wrapped, how do you look at it now?
Thanks, and good afternoon, Stephen. We really welcome the deal. In the end, it's not perfect, but it is definitely a statement of intent. It'll have two benefits for us. It's going to give European automobile manufacturers much better access to the Indian market. First of all, the Indian market is the third largest auto market in the world. If you take in comparison to Germany's around 3 million vehicles, India's 4 million vehicles. So it's a very significant market that has up until this point been highly protected by prohibitive tariffs for passenger cars between 60 to even up to 110%. So it will give us access to that market that we've never had before. And secondly, we can't ignore the kind of geopolitical context, everything that's going on around the world that you mentioned, US, China, the complexity and challenges of those relationships. This is certainly a statement of intent from the European side and also from the Indian side to back open trade, free trade, fair trade, and the rules-based trading system. And we really have to support that. We represent global trading companies, global manufacturing companies with an imprint across the globe. And they source parts, components from all over the world to manufacture here in Europe and want to export those vehicles worldwide. And this is another piece of the puzzle, an important piece in helping them do exactly that.
Okay, so we understand that you welcome the deal. I want to talk about a few of the things that you've pinpointed before as potential sort of hiccups in the deal, potentially. Residual tariffs, for one. It looks like tariffs will fall from, you'd mentioned about 110%. I don't know if that's flat across all classes or what, to, I believe, 30 to 35% at the launch of the deal, then phased down to 10% after 5 years. And you'd mentioned quotas, I think, as well, 250,000, I believe, yearly exports. What does that mean for the industry? How does that compare to other deals? Can you put that in perspective for us?
Yeah, so our starting position on this trade deal would always be we want full liberalization across the board, both for exports, our exports to India, our Indian exports into Europe. That would be our starting position. But the reality of both the auto market in India and the reality of the context of these negotiations means that was never going to be possible. So what we've seen in the end is a deal that is restricted in some of its benefits by limitations on the amount of exports that will receive preferential treatment in India. You mentioned the quotas there. They will actually max out at 250,000 units. It will be only 100,000 from the start of the deal, which does limit the potential benefit to our sector, no doubt about that. Those tariffs will be reduced from those very prohibitive high levels that we mentioned earlier down to that 10%. That makes it much more accessible for, particularly up until this point, the Indian market. Our exports to the Indian market have been dominated by the premium luxury segment. This will open the door to a lot more variety of exports from Europe, including in the volume class, which obviously a lot of European manufacturers are concentrated in that segment. They would not, up until this point, have been able to export to India. Now they can do that. Those quota allocations, various different mechanisms that have been used by the partners to further segment the market are not ideal. We're very honest and very, very open on that. We would prefer to have full liberalization. The reality is that's not going to be possible. Either way, I think the bottom line is this is going to help European manufacturers, it's going to help us build more in Europe to export more there, and that can only be a good thing. So we're definitely going to back this deal.
And of course, manufacturers are not just exporting into the Indian market, they're also building there to some extent. How would you describe the relationship between these manufacturers and India right now?
Almost all European OEMs are manufacturing in India, as are all global OEMs. We have the Indian market has presence, particularly of Japanese manufacturers. They have their local manufacturing, of course. We know that manufacturers in China will be looking at it, building in India too. It is, and of its own right, a very large auto market. If you make the comparison, for example, with China, which is obviously essentially similar, very similar levels of population, the auto market in China is 5 times, 5 or 6 times greater than the auto market in India. So that shows this kind of potential to grow over the future decades. And that investment from European manufacturers is there to stay. It's not going to change under the terms of this deal. They're not going to export purely from Europe now and not continue that investment. That investment will grow and expand. I think this really just gives them a significant amount of variety of what they can offer consumers in India, not just what they build locally, but also potential to add on to that from their exports, say from Europe as well.
There are a lot of comparisons made between China and India. As you've mentioned, they are two very different countries, two different labor forces. I'm curious what manufacturers see when they look there. We think of a very educated, trained manufacturing labor force in China. In India, there's never been the same kind of manufacturing basis with which to begin with. Also, not really the same kind of middle class when we look at purchasing automobiles. How do you look at it? How would you compare the two on those levels?
Right now, it's very hard to make a comparison. We've had this debate, and we have this debate quite frequently in Brussels around diversifying and de-risking from China, and we're very cognizant of the importance of doing that. I mean, recent events have demonstrated how important that is for our industry. But at the same time, we've always really identified this as really generational change. And it's not going to be an overnight shift, right? Because countries like India don't have the same level of development. They will not be the same size of auto markets, certainly not for the next decades. They will grow exponentially, but they won't be a comparison to China in the coming years. They will grow their own indigenous supplier base, particularly as their own capacities for automotive building or automobile building grows. The supplier base there will grow. You mentioned the workforce in terms of capacities, particularly also potentially for advanced technologies in the future, is really significant. But that's going to take a long time to build up. So for our industry, China remains incredibly important. India will increase in terms of its partnership potential for our industry over the years, but nothing will replace China in the short to medium term future, that's for sure.
What do you see, what does your branch see when they look at what the EU has been doing lately in terms of free trade negotiations and agreements? It just finished the ratification of a deal with the leading South American economies known as Mercosur, now India underway. Is this beginning to build onto something that can start to take some of that pressure off these main markets of China, as you mentioned, really the big one, and then of course the US market also in a lot of turmoil? Do you see this kind of bulwark sort of shifting somewhat with these kind of trade deals, or is there still a lot of work left to do?
Both, to be honest. I mean, these help. These deals really do help our industry export. I mean, we saw the example of Mercosur, where we have similarly very high tariffs for access for European automobiles, 35% peaks there, not comparable quite to India, but very significant nonetheless. And I do think that the current geopolitical context has definitely given an impetus to the European Commission's willingness to do these deals. Now, what we seem to be lacking in certain cases is also concomitantly the agreement of EU member states and also of the European Parliament to approve these deals. I mean, Mercosur is now going to be held up, even after member states have approved the deal by the European Parliament. We hope for a quick ratification of the Indian deal, but that remains to be seen. We would hope for other deals as well, Australia, Indonesia, etc., that need to be concluded or approved. And these things take time. It's proper, they take time, they need to be scrutinized by the member states, by the parliament, but from an industrial point of view, that cannot take forever. It needs to be done, and it needs to be done quite soon. These do help our industry diversify away our dependencies on China. It's our number one market. US is our number one export market. We have challenges there in terms of those relationships. And if we are to de-risk or diversify our dependency from those countries, then we need to be doing more trade with the other regions. And these trade deals are important, and they do help.
This was supposed to be a year of more predictable trade with the U.S. following last year. European automakers expecting a 15% tariff importing into the U.S. Then, of course, the threat of additional tariffs, that seems to have subsided. How frustrating is that for the branch, or how difficult is it for the branch knowing that tariff amount can always shift and that there seems to be no final deal? What does that mean for planning?
Yeah, it makes it extremely difficult, Stephen. Nobody in our industry had any expectations that this period was going to be anything other than unpredictable. Even with the deal that was done last year with the US, nobody was fooled into thinking that this was going to be a permanent deal, that there wasn't a risk involved that this deal could be under threat. We would, of course, see that the US has removed its, despite threats, that the actual situation with regard to European exports is that the tariff level is fixed. Europe has made a commitment to reciprocate in terms of removing and reducing its tariffs on industrial goods coming in from the US. We would like to see that process continued, but we do understand that it's a politically very sensitive issue, and we do realize that within the parliament, within member states, the last weeks have been a point of inflection and reflection on the path that we've agreed with the US, and that needs time to consider how to proceed. But we would urge the European Parliament in particular to proceed with approving the tariff removal for US goods, because ultimately we committed to a deal and we need to deliver on the promises that we made in the Turnberry Agreement and the 21st of August deal last year with the US.
We've seen recently the Volkswagen CEO Oliver Blume telling German trade newspaper Handelsblatt that he would expect not to open or further invest in new openings of an Audi plant, I believe, in the U.S. and further development of other manufacturing until there's some sort of deal on tariffs. Do you expect to see other manufacturers, other car companies saying the same? Is that, look, this needs to be whittled down? I think the reasoning there from that article was that the tariffs, of course, raise the cost of inputs for manufacturing in the U.S., for manufacturing for Volkswagen and for other car makers. Is this basically still an ongoing conversation, even about the 15%?
No, I mean, to be honest, I can't comment to any particular decision from an OEM, right? I mean, that's ultimately their decision and the way that they want to approach manufacturing in the US market. I can confirm, obviously, that the level of unpredictability in the markets and the rules that will apply to manufacturing in the US, to importing into the US, and the fact that they are constantly, or seem to be constantly, under scrutiny, that provides a level of unpredictability that's very unhelpful for manufacturers when you're trying to make long-term planning decisions, right? I mean, if you're deciding where to put a manufacturing plant, it's not something that's for the short-term future, it's for the very long-term future. You're looking decades into beyond what the current situation is, and trying to make predictions based on that. And that clearly this current situation, whereby it's continues to be so volatile, is unhelpful for them.
All right, that's Jonathan O'Riordan. He's Director of International Trade at the European Automobile Manufacturers Association. Jonathan, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Stephen. My pleasure.